Duke Alastair Wycliffe spurred his horse through the biting wind, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to see her, had to know if the horrors his mind conjured held any truth. He expected to find a broken woman, a fragile rose withered by the exile he had forced upon her. Instead, as he crested the hill overlooking the tenant village, he saw not ruin, but renewal, and there at the center of it all was his wife. She stood not in silks and jewels, but in a simple wool dress, her face smudged with dirt, her voice clear and strong as she directed two men repairing a roof. She was not weeping, she was leading. She was not destroyed, she was defiant. In that moment, the Duke realized the nightmare wasn't what might happen to her. The nightmare was what he had already done. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The wedding, for all its ducal grandeur, had been a subdued affair. Wycliffe Manor did not lend itself to joyous celebration. It was a fortress of ancient stone, its walls choked with ivy that seemed to hold the grey edifice in a permanent, skeletal embrace. The cavernous halls, lined with the portraits of Alastair's stern-faced ancestors, swallowed light and sound, the very air thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and something else, something like cold, settled dust and forgotten sorrows. Yet, into this oppressive atmosphere, Rose Montgomery had walked, a splash of vibrant color in a monochrome world. The daughter of a minor but respected lord, she was possessed of a spirit so bright it seemed impossible for the manor's shadows to contain it. Her laughter, a sound the halls had not heard in generations, echoed off the stone floors, a melody of pure, unadulterated life. Alastair, the young duke, found he could not look away from her. His love for her was a desperate, possessive thing, a fierce fire in the cold hearth of his existence. He watched her move through the reception, her smile genuine, her kindness touching everyone from the highest-ranking guest to the lowest-serving footman, and felt a knot of fear tighten in his gut. She was a beacon of light, and he had brought her into the suffocating darkness of his lineage. He saw her as his salvation, the one pure thing that could cleanse the gloom from his family's history. But with that hope came a terrifying vulnerability. As he took her hand, her skin warm and alive in his, he sent a silent, fervent prayer to any god that might be listening, a prayer that his love, this overwhelming and all-consuming love, would be enough to build a wall around her, to protect her from the shadows he felt were always watching from the corners of his life. Later, as the last of the guests departed, Rose wandered into the great hall, her fingers tracing the gilded frame of a particularly grim-looking portrait. "Your ancestors all look so serious, my love," she murmured, her voice soft in the echoing space. The man in the painting, Alastair's great-grandfather, stared back with eyes that seemed to hold a universe of regret. Alastair came up behind her, his hands gently taking her shoulders and turning her away from the canvas. "Let's not dwell on them," he said, his voice a low caress. "Their time is past, ours is just beginning." He led her from the hall, away from the silent judgment of the dead, but he could feel their gazes on his back, cold and heavy as a tombstone. The first few weeks of their marriage were a fleeting, idyllic dream. Alastair allowed himself to believe that perhaps the curse, the whispered dread of his family, had died with his father. With Rose by his side, the manor felt less like a prison and more like a home. Her presence filled the empty spaces, her laughter chased away the oppressive silence. One sun-drenched afternoon, they walked in the manor's famed rose gardens. The gardens had been his mother's pride, but since her death, they had been left to grow wild, an untamed riot of color and thorns that seemed to mirror the state of Alastair's own heart. Rose, however, saw only beauty. She moved between the overgrown bushes, her fingers gently touching the petals of a deep crimson bloom, her face alight with simple joy. Alastair watched her, a genuine smile touching his own lips for what felt like the first time in years. In that moment, he was not a duke, not the heir to a cursed line, but simply a man in love with his wife. Then, the sky turned. With an unnatural swiftness, the sun was devoured by a mass of bruised purple clouds that boiled over the horizon. The wind rose to a sudden, violent shriek, tearing through the garden and ripping petals from their stems. A cold, driving rain began to fall. "We must get back inside," Alastair shouted over the rising gale, grabbing Rose's hand. They ran, laughing at first, towards the looming silhouette of the manor. Rose, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, paused for a second on the stone terrace to look back at the tempest-tossed garden. In that split second, a sound like a crack of thunder split the air directly above them. Alistair's head snapped up. A heavy stone gargoyle, its grotesque face twisted in a silent scream, was breaking loose from the parapet high above. It hung for a horrifying moment before plummeting downwards. He acted without thinking, yanking Rose forward with all his strength, pulling her into the shelter of the doorway, just as the gargoyle shattered on the very spot where she had been standing. The staff dismissed it as a freak accident, a consequence of the violent storm and the manor's advanced age. But Alistair knew better. As he stood there, his arms wrapped around a trembling Rose, his face was as pale as death. This was not an accident. It was a warning. The curse, the sorrow of the stones, his father had whispered about on his deathbed, had taken notice of his happiness. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, seeped into his bones. It was the same dread that had haunted his father and his grandfather before him. He saw the pattern, the cruel, inexorable pattern, beginning anew. Rose, sensing the change in him, pulled back. Her concern was no longer for the falling stone, but for the terrifying look in her husband's eyes. She tried to comfort him, to bring him back to the warmth they had shared just moments before, but he was already gone. He became distant, withdrawn, the light in his eyes extinguished, vanishing as completely as the sun behind the storm clouds. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the desk before him, and listened to the storm rage outside and inside his own soul. The joy he had felt with Rose was a poison, a sweet lure from the malevolent force that clung to his family's name. Every Wycliffe who had dared to love, to find true happiness, had been punished. A hunting accident, a wasting sickness, a fall from a balcony. The curse was patient, and it was cruel. It gave its victims a taste of light only to make the ensuing darkness all the more absolute. He had been a fool to think he could be the one to escape it. By bringing Rose here, by loving her, he had painted a target on her back. The gargoyle was the first shot. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that it would not be the last. There was only one way to save her. He had to cut her out of his life, completely and brutally. He had to become a monster to prevent her from meeting one. The next morning, he summoned her to his study. He had ordered the heavy velvet curtains drawn, plunging the room into a gloomy twilight that mirrored the state of his heart. When Rose entered, her face etched with worry, she found a stranger. The loving husband from the garden was gone, replaced by a cold, remote figure whose face was an emotionless mask. He did not rise to greet her. He simply gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "You are to leave the manor," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. "Immediately." Rose stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the words. "Leave?" she repeated, a tremor in her voice. "Alistair, what are you saying? This is my home now. You are my husband." "I was mistaken," he said, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. He could not meet her gaze, could not bear to see the love and confusion in her eyes turn to pain. "This marriage was a mistake. You are not safe here. I have arranged for you to live in a cottage in Oakhaven, on the far edge of the duchy. You will gather your things and you will go. Do not attempt to contact me." Her world, so recently filled with light and hope, shattered into a million pieces. The cruelty of his words was a physical blow. "Not safe?" she cried, rising from her chair, her hands clenched into fists. "What danger could possibly be greater than you, sending me away like this? Tell me what I have done. Tell me the truth." He finally looked at her then, and the agony in his eyes was so profound it almost broke his resolve. But he held firm. He had to. "You have done nothing," he said, his voice cracking for just a moment before he wrestled it back under control. "It is what I have done by bringing you here. Now go, Rose, before it's too late." He turned away from her, facing the curtained window, a silent dismissal. He heard her choked sob, the rustle of her dress as she turned, and the soft click of the door closing behind her. Every cold word had been a dagger in his own heart, but the pain was necessary. It was the price of her life. He remained at the window, a statue carved from grief, and watched until a small, plain carriage, stripped of all ducal insignia, disappeared down the long, winding drive, carrying his heart away with it. The carriage ride was a descent into a new kind of hell. Each jolt and shudder of the simple, unadorned coach on the deeply rutted track felt like a confirmation of Rose's fall from grace. The manicured parklands of the Wycliffe estate, with their ancient oaks and rolling green hills, gave way to sparse, struggling farmland. The road narrowed, the trees grew thinner, and the very air seemed to grow heavier, laden with a damp, earthy scent of neglect. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, the driver, a man whose face was a mask of grim pity, simply pointed. "This is it, Your Grace. Oakhaven." Rose stepped out, her silk traveling dress, once a symbol of her new status, now feeling like a costume in this stark reality. The village was a wound on the landscape, a collection of sagging, timber-framed hovels clustered around a muddy track that served as a main street. Thatched roofs were patched with moss and hope, and the few windows she could see were small and dark, like vacant eyes. A handful of villagers, their faces weary and etched with the hardship of their lives, stopped what they were doing to stare. Their gazes were a painful mixture of raw pity and deep-seated suspicion. This was the Duchess, here? It made no sense. Her new home was pointed out to her, a cottage slightly apart from the others, distinguished only by the deeper shadow it cast. It was small, built of crumbling stone and damp-streaked timber, with a roof that looked one heavy rain away from collapse. As her single trunk was unloaded onto the muddy ground, she became aware of two figures, watching her more intently than the others. An old woman, her back bent with age, but her eyes as sharp and clear as winter frost, stood in the doorway of a nearby cottage. She simply watched, her expression unreadable but radiating a strange, knowing stillness. The other was a man, young and powerfully built, leaning against the wall of a soot-stained building that must be the smithy. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, his face handsome but marred by a cynical sneer. He was covered in a fine layer of grime, and his gaze was openly hostile. As Rose took a hesitant step towards her new prison, he pushed himself off the wall and sauntered over, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes raking over her fine dress, now stained at the hem with mud. "A duchess in Oakhaven," he scoffed, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "The Duke must be tired of his new toy already. Don't expect any handouts here. We've got nothing to give." The words were a slap, sharp and stinging. Rose felt tears welling, hot and furious, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, her own voice trembling but laced with a thread of steel she didn't know she possessed. "I am not asking for anything." Back at Wycliffe Manor, the silence was a physical entity. It pressed in on Alistair from all sides, a crushing weight where Rose's laughter had once been. The vast echoing halls became his torture chamber, every empty room a monument to his failure. He took to wandering the castle at night, a bottle of brandy his only companion, his footsteps the only sound. He would stand in the doorway of their bedroom, the scent of lavender and roses, her scent, still clinging to the air, a ghostly caress that twisted the knife of his guilt. He saw her everywhere, a phantom of memory, her smile a silent accusation. He drank to forget, to numb the agonizing ache in his chest, but the alcohol only sharpened the edges of his pain, offering no solace, only a descent into a hazy, self-loathing stupor. He would often collapse into the large leather chair in his study, the fire long dead in the hearth, and fall into a fitful, tormented sleep. And then the nightmares began. They were not the fleeting, nonsensical dreams of a troubled mind. They were hyper-realistic, vivid tableaus of horror that felt more real than his waking hours. The first time, he dreamt he was standing outside her cottage in Oakhaven. He saw her through the grimy window, her face pale and thin, her vibrant spirit extinguished. Then, a shadow began to seep through the walls. It was not a simple absence of light, but a formless, sentient darkness, a creeping black mold that pulsed with a malevolence he could feel in his own soul. He watched, paralyzed, as the shadow wrapped its tendrils around her, and he could see the last vestiges of color and life draining from her face, her skin turning ashen, her eyes growing dull and lifeless. He tried to scream her name, to warn her, but the sound was trapped in his throat. He could only watch as the thing that haunted his bloodline consumed the woman he loved. He woke with a violent jolt, the scream finally tearing from his lungs, his voice raw and desperate in the crushing emptiness of the study. "Rose!" He was drenched in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape his body. The curse wasn't just a series of unfortunate accidents. It was a thinking, feeling entity, a predator, and it was angry. He had tried to cheat it, to hide its intended prey, and now it was tormenting him with visions of what it would do to her anyway. He was utterly, hopelessly powerless, a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the ghost of a woman who was still alive. For Rose, the first days in Oakhaven were a blur of misery and shock. The cottage was even worse on the inside. It smelled of damp earth and decay, and a persistent chill clung to the very stones. It was barely furnished with a lumpy straw mattress on a crude wooden frame, a single rickety chair, and a small, soot-blackened fireplace. She spent the first night huddled in her traveling cloak, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls, the sound a lonely counterpoint to her own silent sobs. The villagers kept their distance, their suspicion a wall she had no energy to climb. She was an outcast, a fallen duchess, a curiosity they observed from afar. She felt herself shrinking, the vibrant woman who had walked into Wycliffe Manor with so much hope withering under the weight of despair. She was adrift, without purpose, her only task the simple, grim business of surviving each day. Then, a crisis erupted in the village. A small boy, the son of a weaver, fell gravely ill. A fever had taken hold of him, and he burned with a heat that seemed to be consuming him from within. The local apothecary, a nervous man with more confidence than skill, had offered only useless, foul-smelling tonics that did nothing. The boy's parents were distraught, their faces masks of helpless terror as they watched their child fade before their eyes. Rose overheard their panicked whispers as she forced herself to walk through the village, unwilling to remain a prisoner in her cottage. The symptoms they described, the raging fever, the weakness, the delirium, sparked a flicker of memory. She remembered her mother, a woman with a deep and practical knowledge of herbal remedies, describing a similar illness. She had taught Rose which leaves to look for, which roots to dig up. For the first time since her arrival, a feeling other than grief stirred within her. It was a fragile, hesitant sense of purpose. Leaving the village behind, she ventured into the sparse woods that bordered the duchy's lands. It was a landscape that mirrored her own feelings, full of thorns and tangled undergrowth, but she pushed through, her eyes scanning the ground. She remembered the gardens at her family home, the specific look of the broad, cool leaves of feverfew, the distinct, earthy smell of yarrow. After an hour of searching, she found them, growing in a sheltered patch near a small stream, the same herbs that had grown in such abundance at her childhood home. She gathered them carefully, her fingers working with a certainty that surprised her. Back in her cold, damp cottage, she crushed the leaves and roots, brewing a bitter tea and creating a poultice. With a deep breath, she walked to the weaver's cottage and knocked. The mother answered, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow with despair. Seeing the Duchess, holding a steaming cup and a small bundle of cloth, she looked merely confused. Rose, her voice quiet but steady, explained what she had made. "It may help," she said simply. "My mother used it. It may bring the fever down." With nothing left to lose, the woman let her in. Rose spent the afternoon by the child's bedside, gently coaxing the bitter tea down his throat and applying the cool poultice to his forehead. She spoke to him in soft, soothing tones, a comforting murmur in the tense, silent cottage. The cynical blacksmith, Finn, stood in the doorway for a time, watching the scene with his unreadable dark eyes, before turning and walking away without a word. As dusk fell, the child's breathing began to even out. The frantic, burning heat started to recede from his skin. By morning, the fever had broken. The weaver's wife wept, but this time her tears were of overwhelming gratitude. She clasped Rose's hands, her words tumbling out in a torrent of thanks. The news spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. The villagers' stares began to change. The suspicion lessened, replaced by a grudging respect, a nascent curiosity. As Rose walked back to her own cottage, the old woman with the knowing eyes, Elara, was waiting in her doorway. She didn't speak, but she gave Rose a small, deliberate nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement that was more meaningful than 1,000 words of praise. For the first time since Alistair had sent her away, Rose felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was the feeling of being useful, of making a difference. She realized that the life she'd had before, the knowledge she'd taken for granted, had value here. In the ruins of her old life, in this place of neglect and hardship, she had found a single, tiny spark of purpose. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a start. It was something to hold on to in the darkness. The single spark of purpose, once a fragile flicker in the overwhelming darkness of Rose's despair, did not die out. Instead, she nurtured it. The gratitude in the weaver's eyes was a kindling she had not realized she so desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, Rose stopped being a prisoner of her circumstance and started becoming an architect of her environment. She walked through Oakhaven not with the downcast eyes of an exile, but with the sharp, observant gaze of a leader surveying her domain. She saw the communal well, its water murky and tasting of earth, a breeding ground for the very fevers she had just fought. She saw a wide, fallow plot of land behind the cottages, choked with weeds but blessed with southern sun, lying dormant, while children went to bed with hollow bellies. She saw young mothers, their faces etched with exhaustion, trying to mend clothes or tend to chores with toddlers clinging to their skirts, their labor divided and inefficient. Her first project was the well. She gathered the villagers, her voice, once soft and melodic in the gilded halls of the manor, now carrying a new timbre of quiet authority. She proposed they drain and scrub it. There was hesitation, the ingrained weariness of people who had been given no reason to hope for improvement. But the weaver and his wife were the first to agree, their voices loud and firm, and that was enough to sway the others. Even Finn, the cynical blacksmith, watched from his doorway, and after an hour of seeing women and old men hauling buckets, he emerged from the smithy, wiping his hands on a rag, and without a word, began fashioning a new, more effective winch mechanism for the well bucket. The work was hard and muddy, but as the stones of the well were scrubbed clean, and the water that eventually refilled it ran clear and sweet, a collective sense of accomplishment settled over the village. It was a small victory, but it was theirs. Emboldened, Rose moved to her next objective. She needed resources. The fallow land could become a garden, but they needed seeds. The coming winter would be harsh, and many of the cottage roofs were in desperate need of repair, but they needed timber. All of these things existed within the duchy, locked away in storehouses controlled by the Duke's steward, a man named Croft. Rose requested a meeting. Mr. Croft was a man who seemed perpetually folded in on himself, his shoulders stooped, his face a collection of soft, deferential lines. He received her in a small, tidy office in a nearby town, the administrative heart of the duchy's lands. He was all polite apologies and regretful smiles. "My apologies, Your Grace," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. But the Duke's instructions were perfectly clear. In the interest of fiscal responsibility, no new resources are to be diverted to Oakhaven. We must all tighten our belts in these trying times. Rose looked at his well-fed frame, his clean fingernails, his comfortable office, and felt a cold anger rise within her. This was the man who was starving the Duke's people in the Duke's name. She leaned forward, her hands flat on his polished desk, and for the first time since her banishment, she consciously wielded her title not as a memory of a life she had lost, but as a weapon. "The Duke is not here, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "I am. I live in Oakhaven. I see the hunger and the cold that you, from your warm office, deem a necessary fiscal responsibility. These people are the Duke's tenants, and their suffering is the Duke's shame, and I will not have it be mine." She straightened up, her gaze unwavering. "You will release the timber from the old mill. You will provide the seed grain from the main storehouse. Or I will write to my father, Lord Montgomery, and I will tell him in great detail how the Duke of Wycliffe treats his new bride and his loyal subjects. I imagine the other great houses would be very interested to learn of it." The deferential smile on Croft's face tightened. A flicker of something hard and cold passed through his eyes before being quickly veiled. He saw not a broken girl, but a formidable woman. He gave a slight, stiff bow of his head. "As your grace commands," he murmured. The timber and seed arrived the next day. The villagers, seeing the wagon-loads of resources, looked at Rose with a new kind of awe. Led by a now openly supportive Finn, whose cynicism had been burned away by Rose's fire, the men began repairing the roofs, while the women, under Rose's guidance, tilled the fallow earth, planting the seeds of their future. Rose, the exiled duchess, had become the Duchess of Oakhaven, her authority earned not by birthright, but by action. While Rose was building a community from ruins, Alistair was excavating a history of madness. His nightmares had become more specific, more terrifyingly personal. He no longer just saw the formless shadow consuming Rose. Now, his ancestors were there. He would dream he was in the grand portrait hall, and the painted eyes of his forefathers would begin to weep black tears. Their faces, once stern and stoic, would contort in silent screams, their hands stretching from the canvases, their bony fingers pointing, first at him, then at a shadowy, indistinct depiction of Rose cowering in a corner. The dreamscape was always cold, filled with the scent of damp stone and decay, and a single recurring image began to haunt his waking thoughts as much as his sleep. A raven with a single, grotesquely broken wing. It would appear perched on a skeletal tree outside Rose's cottage, or its sigil would be branded onto the foreheads of his screaming ancestors. It was a symbol of profound wrongness, and he felt it was a key he had to understand. Driven by a desperation that bordered on insanity, he did something no Wycliffe had done in 50 years. He unsealed the family's private archives. The archives were not a library but a tomb, a series of stone-walled rooms in the manor's oldest wing, where the air was frigid and smelled of dust and brittle, decaying paper. He spent his days and nights in that cold, silent place, a single candelabra casting flickering, dancing shadows on the towering shelves. He pored over the spidery script of his ancestors' journals, the brittle pages of their letters, the dry, factual entries of old estate records, and he found the pattern, undeniable and chilling. His great-grandfather, a man who wrote of his new wife with soaring, poetic love, died in a hunting accident, less than a year after his wedding, his horse apparently spooked by a shadow. His grandfather, whose journal was filled with joyful descriptions of his infant son, Alistair's father, wasted away from a deep melancholy that no doctor could explain or cure, his entries growing more paranoid and erratic until they devolved into meaningless scribbles. And his own father, who had loved his mother with a quiet but profound passion, had fallen from the very balcony where the gargoyle had broken loose. A fall ruled an accident but whispered about as a suicide. Each tragedy struck shortly after the man had found a deep, abiding happiness with a woman he loved. The journals were filled with increasingly frantic mentions of the shadow, of the sorrow of the stones, of a creeping paranoia that made them see enemies in every corner. Then, in his grandfather's final lucid journal, tucked away in a leather-bound volume filled with architectural drawings of the manor, Alistair found it. A detailed, beautifully rendered sketch of a raven, its left wing bent back at an impossible angle, and beneath it, scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand, was a single word: betrayal. In Oakhaven, Elara watched the transformation of the village, and of Rose, with her sharp, knowing eyes. She had seen many seasons of hardship, many empty promises from the great house on the hill, but this was different. The young Duchess did not command from a distance. She worked alongside them, her hands in the dirt, her face smudged with soil. One evening, as Rose was walking back to her cottage, her body weary but her spirit alight with the day's accomplishments, Elara beckoned her over. "Come, child," the old woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Take tea with an old woman." Rose accepted, entering the small, tidy cottage that smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs. Elara's home was the opposite of her own, filled with a sense of peace and accumulated wisdom. The old woman moved with a slow, deliberate grace, pouring steaming tea into two mismatched cups. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Elara spoke. "You have a strength the Wycliffe men have long forgotten," she said, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam from her cup. "They hide in their stone fortress, believing the walls will protect them from the sorrows of the world. But they never understood. The danger was never outside. It was always inside with them." Rose's heart gave a painful throb. "What danger?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Alistair, my husband. He said I wasn't safe. He sent me away to protect me." Elara finally looked at her, her ancient eyes holding a deep, profound sadness. "He was right, child. You were not safe there, but he did not know why. He sees ghosts and curses because that is the story his father told him." She took a slow sip of her tea. "The sorrow of that house is old, older than the Wycliffes themselves." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. For the first time, a new thought began to form in Rose's mind, a seed of doubt not about Alistair's actions, but about his motivations. The cold, cruel man in the study, The husband who had shattered her world began to recede, replaced by the image of a terrified man, a man so consumed by fear that he would perform an act of monstrous cruelty in the name of love. The anger that had been her shield for weeks began to crack, and beneath it, she felt the first stirrings of a pained, sorrowful understanding. The curse was real to him, and Ilara's words suggested it was something more tangible, more deeply rooted than a simple ghost story. The nightmare that finally broke him was different. It was not a distant, hazy vision of Rose suffering, but an intimate, immediate assault on his own sanity. He dreamt he was in the library, the room where he had spent countless hours trying to decipher the madness of his ancestors. The air was unnaturally cold, and the candlelight from the candelabra on his desk seemed to cast shadows that were too deep, too dark. One of them, the one in the corner by the towering shelves of Wycliffe history, began to move. It detached itself from the wall, not like a trick of the light, but like a spill of black ink rising from the floor. It coalesced, gathering itself into a vaguely man-shaped form of pure, featureless darkness, a void in the fabric of the room. It drifted towards him, silent and inexorable, and as it passed the shelves, the leather-bound journals seemed to recoil on their own. A voice, a sibilant whisper that seemed to come from inside his own head, slithered into his consciousness. Asterisk, you tried to hide her from me. Asterisk, it hissed, the words cold as grave dirt. Asterisk, you cannot cheat the sorrow of the stones. Since you will not let me have your joy, I will have you instead. Asterisk. A coldness so profound it felt like a physical blow slammed into him, accompanied by a surge of white-hot rage that was not his own. It was an ancient, bitter fury, and it wanted to destroy. He woke not in his bed, nor in the chair in his study, but on his feet in the library itself. The smell of smoke, acrid and choking, filled his nostrils. The air was hot. He looked down, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the nightmare and reality, and saw flames licking at the edge of a priceless Persian rug. The heavy silver candelabra lay on its side, its candles having rolled beneath the ancient wooden desk where the Wycliffe journals, the only clues he had, were stacked. The fire was already greedily consuming the corner of the rug and had begun to char the leg of the desk. Horror, sharp and absolute, sliced through the last vestiges of sleep. He had done this. While asleep, under the influence of the nightmare, he had walked here and nearly destroyed the very history he was trying to understand. With a strangled cry, he grabbed another heavier rug from the floor and threw it over the flames, beating at the fire with his bare hands, ignoring the searing pain as he smothered the blaze. He collapsed to his knees, panting, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he stared at the blackened, smoldering mess. The curse was no longer content to haunt his sleep. It was in him. It was wearing his body like a suit of clothes, making him a puppet for its malevolent will. He had thought that by sending Rose away, he was keeping her safe, but he had done nothing. He had only turned the curse's full attention upon himself, and it was consuming him. A new, more terrifying thought seized him. What if Rose wasn't even real anymore? What if his memories of her, the nightmares, the guilt, were all just part of the poison in his mind, a phantom conjured by the curse to drive him to his end? He had to know. He had to see her, to touch her, to prove to himself that she was a living, breathing woman and not just a ghost in his head. He did not wait for dawn. He did not bother to change his soot-stained clothes or wash the grime from his face. He ran to the stables, his movements frantic and clumsy, and saddled his fastest horse himself, his hands still trembling too much to properly fasten the buckles. He rode out of the Wycliffe gates like a man possessed, a wild, haunted figure galloping through the pre-dawn gloom. The wind tore at his disheveled hair and bit at his skin, but he felt nothing but the frantic, desperate need to get to Oakhaven. He spurred the horse relentlessly, his mind a maelstrom of terrifying possibilities. He pictured the village as he remembered it, a place of quiet despair and grinding poverty. He pictured the cottage, damp and crumbling, and he pictured Rose, his vibrant, beautiful Rose, wasting away inside it, her spirit broken, her body succumbing to sickness and neglect, a fragile flower withered by the harshness of the exile he had forced upon her. He expected to find her waiting, a broken woman waiting for the husband who had abandoned her to either return or let her die. The guilt was a physical weight, threatening to crush him. As he crested the final hill that overlooked the small valley where Oakhaven lay, The rising sun broke through the clouds, bathing the landscape in a soft, golden light. Alistair pulled his horse to a sudden, jarring halt. He stared, his haunted eyes wide with disbelief. This was not the Oakhaven he remembered. The muddy track that had served as a street was now a neatly packed road of gravel and earth. The sagging roofs had been repaired. The dark, vacant windows now held clean glass that glinted in the morning sunday. He could hear the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood, the distant bleating of sheep, and something he had never heard in this place before, the sound of children's laughter. To the side of the village, where a fallow, weed-choked field had once been, was a vast, thriving communal garden, its neat rows bursting with the green of late-season vegetables. It was not a place of ruin, but of renewal. It was not a place of despair, but of life. And then he saw her. She was standing in the center of the village, her back to him. She was not wearing the silks and jewels of a duchess, but a simple, practical dress of dark wool, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her face, as she turned to speak to two men who were working on a new cottage frame, was smudged with a streak of dirt. But her posture was straight and strong, her voice clear and confident as she pointed to a section of the frame, directing their work. She was not weeping. She was leading. She was not destroyed. She was defiant. In that single, stunning moment, Alistair was hit by a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked him from his saddle. It was a tidal wave of shock, of profound, gut-wrenching shame, and of overwhelming, breathtaking awe. His grand, tragic plan had been to protect her by isolating her, by making her a helpless victim who needed his salvation. But she had not waited to be saved. She had not only survived, she had thrived. He had not saved her, he had abandoned her, and in his absence, she had saved herself and, by the looks of it, everyone else he had also abandoned. The nightmare wasn't what might happen to her in the future. The nightmare was what he had already done. He dismounted, his legs unsteady, and began to walk down the hill towards the village, his fine leather boots sinking into the soft earth. As he approached, the sounds of work and laughter slowly died out. The villagers, who had been moving with such purpose, stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at him. Their faces held no pity, only a guarded, watchful curiosity. He saw the blacksmith, Finn, who had been helping the other men with the cottage frame, set down his hammer and moved to stand protectively near Rose, his hand coming to rest on the head of a heavy mallet tucked into his belt. The message was clear. She was under their protection now. Alistair stopped a few feet from her, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the woman she had become. The soft, trusting girl he had married was gone. In her place stood a leader, her eyes holding a strength he had never seen before, and a coldness that was entirely his own doing. All the words he had rehearsed on his frantic ride, the explanations, the apologies, the desperate pleas for understanding, all of it turned to ash in his throat. He was stripped bare before her, his grand, tragic gesture revealed for the selfish, cowardly act it truly was. His voice, when he finally found it, was a hoarse, broken whisper. "Rose, I came back." She did not move. Her gaze was unwavering, her expression unreadable. "Did you?" she asked, her voice devoid of any warmth, as cool and clear as the water from their newly cleaned well. "Or did your ghosts chase you here?" "We have been busy, Alistair." She made a small, deliberate gesture that took in the entire transformed village. "We have been surviving you." The words were a blade that slid between his ribs, precise and devastating. "I did it to protect you," he choked out, the justification sounding feeble and pathetic even to his own ears. A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. It was a sound so unlike the joyful laughter he remembered that it made him flinch. "Protect me?" she repeated, and now her voice was laced with a cold, hard anger. She took a step towards him, her eyes blazing. "Look around you, Alistair. Look at what your protection looked like. Your protection looked like starvation. Your protection looked like leaking roofs and sick children and despair. We did not need your protection." She stopped directly in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "We needed our duke. We needed the man who swore an oath to his people. And he was hiding in his castle, haunted by stories, while his people learned to live without him." His words, his pathetic justification, hung in the air between them, stripped of all power by the reality of her survival. He saw in her eyes not forgiveness, but a judgment colder and more absolute than any he had ever faced from his ancestors' portraits. He began to explain, the words tumbling out of him in a raw, desperate torrent. He spoke of the nightmares, the journals filled with paranoia and death, the recurring symbol of the broken-winged raven, the chillingly consistent pattern of Wycliffe men who found love only to be snatched away by tragedy. He was not asking for pity. He was simply laying the pieces of his madness at her feet, hoping she could see the shape of the monster that had driven him. Rose listened, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unmoving. She heard the story, the ghost tale that had cost her everything, and it sounded hollow against the solid, tangible achievements surrounding them. The new roof on the weaver's cottage, the clear water in the well, the sturdy rows of vegetables in the garden. These things were real. His ghosts were not. When he finally fell silent, his voice having dwindled to a ragged whisper, she did not soften. "Your family's ghosts are not my concern, Alistair," she said, her voice cutting through his haze of self-pity. "The lives of these people are. Their hunger is real. Their sickness is real. If you wish to stay, you will not stay as a duke, a tragic figure from a storybook. You will stay as a man. You will work. You will earn your place here, just as I did." The command was so unexpected, so audacious, that it shocked him into stillness. He, the Duke of Wycliffe, to work as a common labourer. The ingrained pride of his lineage, the centuries of aristocratic privilege, rose up in him, a reflexive, indignant protest. But then he looked at her, at the unyielding strength in her face, and he looked at the village she had rebuilt from his neglect, and the pride crumbled into dust. This was his penance. It was not just a punishment, it was a path. It was the only way back, not to his title, but to the man he had been before the curse had consumed him, the man she had once loved. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached up and unfastened the heavy clasp of his riding coat. The fine wool, embroidered with the subtle crest of his house, felt absurdly out of place here. He shrugged it off his shoulders and let it fall to the ground, a dark pool of velvet and silk in the dirt. He stood before her in his simple linen shirt, stripped of his rank, a man laid bare. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Finn, who had been watching the entire exchange with a thunderous expression, stepped forward. His initial instinct was to throw the Duke out of the village bodily, but he saw the look in Rose's eyes, a complex mixture of steel and something else he couldn't quite name. He trusted her judgment. He jerked his head towards a pile of rough-hewn stones near the half-finished cottage. "We need a foundation wall built before the first frost," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "If you're a man, then work like one." Alistair's first day was a study in humiliation. The stones were heavy and sharp-edged, tearing at the soft, uncalloused skin of his hands within the first hour. His back, accustomed to fine upholstery and the gentle gait of a well-bred horse, screamed in protest. He was clumsy, his movements inefficient, and he could feel the eyes of the villagers on him, watching the incredible, pathetic sight of their duke fumbling with the basic tools of their existence. Finn offered no guidance, only stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of grim satisfaction as Alistair struggled. But Alistair did not stop. Every searing pain in his muscles, every drop of sweat that stung his eyes, every raw blister that formed on his palms was a prayer of atonement. He was not just lifting stones, he was lifting the weight of his own failure, his own cowardice. He worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, until his body was a single throbbing ache, and his hands were raw and bleeding. He collapsed onto the straw mattress in a small, empty cottage they had assigned him, too exhausted to even wash the grime from his face, and for the first time in months, he slept without nightmares. In the evenings, a new routine formed. After a simple meal of bread and stew, eaten in the communal silence of people too tired for conversation, Alistair would go to Rose's cottage. The tension between them remained, a thick, heavy blanket of unspoken words and unresolved pain. But it was slowly changing. It was less the animosity of a broken marriage and more the cautious, wary circling of two people trying to find a new language. He would spread the singed, brittle pages from the archives on her small, rough-hewn table, the candlelight casting long, dancing shadows over the spidery script and frantic drawings. Rose, her skepticism a sharp, practical tool, would listen to his theories of a sentient curse and then pick them apart with relentless logic. "Why only the men?" she asked one evening, her finger tracing the family tree he had drawn. If this curse is tied to the Wycliffe blood, why did it spare your mother, your grandmother? And the symptoms, this melancholy, this paranoia, it sounds more like a sickness than a haunting. Her questions were like stones dropped into the murky pool of his fear, sending out ripples of clarity. He had been so lost in the folklore of his family that he had failed to see the facts. Together, they decided to speak with Alara again, not just as a source of village whispers, but as a historian whose knowledge was written in memory rather than on paper. They went to her cottage the next evening, the setting sun casting their long shadows before them. They were a strange pair, the Duke in his dirt-stained work clothes and the Duchess in her simple wool dress, a united front for the first time since their wedding day. Alara greeted them with her usual knowing stillness, her sharp eyes taking in the sight of them standing together on her doorstep. She invited them in, and Alistair, his hands still clumsy with bandages, carefully unrolled the drawing of the broken-winged raven and placed it on her table. "Have you seen this symbol before?" he asked. Alara's face, usually a placid mask of wrinkles, grew grim. The knowing sadness in her eyes deepened into something darker. "This is no family's crest," she said, her voice a low, serious murmur. "This is a warning. The old ones, my grandmother's people, they did not call it a raven. They called it Times Corvus Fractus Asterisk, the broken crow. It is not a bird, my lord. It is a fungus." The word hung in the air, so mundane and yet so terrifying. A fungus. Not a demon, not a ghost, not a curse. A fungus, Alara explained, her voice weaving a story far older and more terrible than the Wycliffe ghost tales. The specific type of pale, porous stone that had been quarried from the northern hills to build the manor, a stone prized for its beauty, had a dark secret. In the damp, cool conditions of the manor's deep foundations and lower levels, it played host to the Times Corvus Fractus Asterisk. The fungus, when its spores were inhaled over many years, was a slow-acting poison. It did not kill quickly. It worked on the mind, inducing paranoia, vivid hallucinations, fits of rage, and a slow, wasting sickness that drained the life from a man. A madness from the stones. She told them of her grandmother, an herbalist who had served at the manor 2 generations ago. She had seen the affliction in Alistair's grandfather, had tried to warn him, to treat him with purifying teas, and to urge him to spend more time in the sun and fresh air, away from the manor's lower wings, where the Duke's study and private chambers had always been. But the Duke, already in the grip of the poison's paranoia, had seen her concern as a threat. He had dismissed her, calling her a hedge witch, and retreated deeper into the stone embrace that was slowly killing him. The Wycliffe men, living and working for generations in the oldest, grandest, most poorly ventilated parts of the castle, had been breathing in their own doom. The women, who typically spent their time in the sunnier, airier upper floors and gardens, were largely spared. A horrifying, liberating clarity washed over Alistair. The ghosts were real, but they had been born in the poisoned minds of his fathers. The whispers, the shadows, the crushing despair, it was all chemistry, not destiny. His family was not cursed, they had been poisoned. His father's fall from the balcony, his grandfather's wasting sickness, it was not fate or weakness, it was the inexorable progression of a disease. He looked at Rose and saw the anger in her face had finally, completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. She looked at the haunted man before her, a man who had performed an act of unimaginable cruelty because he was trying to outrun a truth he could not see, a truth that was literally in the air he breathed. The revelation, however, brought a new, more sinister question. If Alara's grandmother had known, others must have suspected. Why was nothing ever done? Rose's mind, sharp and practical, seized on a recent memory. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice tight, "when I demanded timber for the village, I also asked about repairing the manor's foundations. I had seen the damp rot in the lower cellars." He was adamant, said the cost was prohibitive, that the Duke's funds could not be stretched to such a massive undertaking. At the time, it had seemed like simple bureaucratic obstruction. Now, it felt like a deliberate lie. Her words triggered a memory in Alistair, a conversation from years ago, hazy but now snapping into sharp focus. His father had been considering a major renovation, a plan to bring more light and air into the gloomy ground floor, to install a modern ventilation system. He remembered Croft, his face a mask of deferential concern, skillfully guiding his father away from the idea. He had praised the manor's historical integrity, its unspoiled character, and had gently steered the funds towards purely cosmetic projects, regilding the ballroom ceiling, retiling the conservatory, projects on the upper floors, far from the source of the poison. They looked at each other, the same name, a cold weight in the air between them. Croft, the loyal steward, the man whose family had served the Wycliffes for generations. He was the only common link, the constant, quiet presence, the whisper in the ear of 3 successive dukes. Finn, who had been standing guard outside Ilara's door, had heard the name through the thin wooden door. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his face grim. "Croft," he said, his voice a low growl. "My grandfather used to tell a story. Most have forgotten it now. The Wycliffes have not always been lords of this valley." He told them a piece of local history that had been deliberately scrubbed from the official records, a story of a time before a king's decree had granted the lands to the first Wycliffe duke for his service in a war. Before the Wycliffes, the Crofts had been the lords of this land. They were an ancient family, their roots as deep as the oldest oaks, and they had been stripped of their title, their home, their legacy, forced into servitude to the very men who had replaced them. The full, horrifying truth descended upon the small, candle-lit cottage. The loyalty of the Croft family was a lie, a mask for a patient, centuries-long thirst for revenge. Croft knew about the poison in the stones. His ancestors had likely known. He had not just been a negligent steward, he had been a silent executioner. He had watched the Wycliffe lords sicken and die, one by one, actively discouraging any repair or renovation that might have saved them, all while wearing a mask of unimpeachable loyalty. He was waiting for the Wycliffe line to destroy itself, to choke on its own stolen legacy. The broken winged raven was not a Wycliffe symbol of betrayal. It was a Croft symbol of vengeance, a promise that a crow, once broken, would never forget. The ride back to Wycliffe Manor was a silent, grim procession. The setting sun painted the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple, a celestial wound that mirrored the centuries of quiet violence they had just uncovered. Alistair rode at the front, his face a mask of cold fury, the aches in his body from a day of labor forgotten, replaced by the sharp, energizing focus of purpose. Beside him, Rose was a study in stillness, her fear transmuted into a hard, unyielding resolve. And just behind them, Finn and a handful of the strongest men from the village followed, their faces grim, their hands resting on hammers and axes, no longer just tenants but a small, loyal army. There was no plan discussed, no strategy debated. There was only a single, unspoken objective that pulsed between them, a shared heartbeat of impending justice. They did not use the main gate but circled around to a lesser-used service entrance, the iron hinges groaning in protest as Finn forced them open. They left the horses and moved on foot through the manicured gardens, the familiar scent of roses now seeming cloying and funereal. The manor loomed before them, no longer a home haunted by sad ghosts, but the lair of a patient, living monster. They entered through the kitchens, the staff scattering in confusion and fear at the sight of their grim-faced duke, his duchess, and a posse of grim-faced villagers. They did not stop, moving with relentless purpose through the service corridors and emerging into the cavernous main hall. And there he was, Mr. Croft stood by the grand fireplace, calmly warming his hands as if expecting them. He turned as they entered, and the soft, deferential mask he had worn for a lifetime fell away, revealing the hard, triumphant face beneath. He smiled, a chilling, reptilian expression of pure, unadulterated hatred that had been festering for generations. "I wondered how long it would take the little Duchess to piece it all together," Croft said, his voice, once so smooth and obsequious, now dripping with a venomous satisfaction. "Your ancestors were fools, every last one of them, so lost in their own legends of curses and shadows, they never thought to look at the stones beneath their feet." Alistair took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "It was you. All of them. My father, my grandfather. You let them die." Croft's smile widened. "Let them? My dear Duke, I nurtured their deaths. A word here against proper ventilation, a forged report there about the cost of foundation repair. It required so little, just patience." He spread his hands, a gesture of mock generosity. "Curse? No, just chemistry, And patience. My family has served yours for 200 years, waiting for this, waiting for your line to choke on its own stolen legacy. And you, my lord?" He looked Alistair up and down, taking in the effects of the poison that were already subtly present in his pallor and the slight tremor in his hands. "Are the last. The poison has been in your blood since you were a boy. It's far too late for you." With a speed that belied his age, Croft's hand darted inside his coat and emerged with a long, thin dagger. But he did not move towards Alistair. He lunged at Rose. "The final Wycliffe bride," he sneered, his eyes alight with a mad final victory. And the end of the line. Love, pure and primal, was a force faster than poison, faster than thought. Alistair moved with a speed born not of strength, but of absolute, unconditional devotion. He threw himself in front of Rose, his body intercepting Croft's lunge. The move was clumsy, desperate, but it was enough. The dagger, intended for Rose's heart, instead slashed across Alistair's forearm as he slammed into the steward, sending them both stumbling backward. The fight was not a noble duel of flashing swords, but a brutal, ugly brawl that crashed through the opulent hall. It was a fight between two legacies, one of stolen power and one of patient hate. Croft was wiry and surprisingly strong, fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage. But Alistair, though weakened by the toxins that had been slowly unmaking him, fought with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He felt his nerves screaming, his muscles responding a fraction too slowly, the poison a traitor in his own blood. They crashed into a delicate console table, sending priceless porcelain shattering to the marble floor. Croft jabbed the dagger forward again, and Alistair, unable to dodge in time, simply caught the blade in his hand, a searing, white-hot pain shooting up his arm as he wrenched the weapon from the steward's grasp and flung it across the room, where it clattered uselessly against the stone wall. He drove his fist into Croft's face, the crunch of bone a sickeningly satisfying sound. He wrestled the older man to the ground, his hands closing around Croft's throat, the rage he had inherited from his poisoned ancestors finally finding its true target. But the effort, the surge of adrenaline, was too much for his compromised body. As Finn and his men rushed forward to pull the sputtering, defeated steward away, the strength fled from Alistair's limbs. A violent tremor racked his body, and he collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the world dissolved into a vortex of black spots and searing pain. "Alistair!" Rose's scream echoed in the vast hall. She rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his pale, sweat-sheened face. He was convulsing, his body seized by the poison he had fought so hard to ignore. Finn, his face a mask of grim fury, bound the now whimpering Croft's hands with a length of rope from a curtain tieback. "Get him to the cellars," he snarled at his men, who hauled the steward away. He knelt beside Rose, his voice losing its hard edge. "What do we do?" Rose's mind raced, frantically pushing past the rising tide of panic. "Ilara." The conversation in the herb-scented cottage. She had spoken of the fungus, the madness, but had she mentioned anything else? A possible antidote, a rare herb called sunroot that counteracts the fungus's neurotoxin. The words, spoken almost as an aside, now blazed in her memory like a beacon. "Sunroot," she said, her voice tight with desperate hope. "Ilara said there might be a cure, an herb. We have to find it." She looked around the grand, cold manor. "The apothecary. There must be one." Finn nodded, his mind instantly grasping the task. "The west wing, near the old infirmary." Together, they half-carried, half-dragged Alistair from the main hall, his body a dead weight, his breathing growing fainter with every passing second. They laid him on a dusty chaise lounge in a forgotten parlour before racing towards the apothecary. It was a room that had not been used in decades, a place of glass-stoppered jars and wooden drawers, all covered in a thick blanket of dust. The air was stale with the ghostly sense of 100 forgotten remedies. It was a library of forgotten cures, and they were searching for a single, specific word. Rose, her hands shaking, began pulling open drawers, her eyes scanning the faded, spidery labels. Finn did the same on the other side of the room, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he sifted through the fragile glass bottles. It was a frantic, desperate search against a ticking clock. Finally, in a small flat drawer near the bottom of a cabinet, Rose found it. A small linen bag with a faded label. Asterisk radix solis asterisk. Sun root. Inside were a few gnarled, pale yellow roots, dry and brittle with age. Following the faint memory of Ilara's instructions, she crushed the root into a powder using a heavy marble pestle and mortar, her movements swift and certain. She mixed the powder with a small amount of wine from a dusty decanter, creating a murky, bitter-smelling liquid. With Finn's help, she lifted Alistair's head and forced the bitter liquid down his throat, praying it was not too late. They could only wait and hope, as the Duke lay still as death in the forgotten room of his own castle. Months later, the scene was not one of death, but of vibrant, burgeoning life. The sun shone down on the thriving village of Oakhaven, illuminating a community reborn. On a gentle hill overlooking the village, where one could see the neat rows of the communal garden and hear the laughter of children, stood a new house. It was not a castle, not a fortress of grim stone, but a handsome, welcoming manor house built of warm timber and local fieldstone, with wide windows that drank in the light. In the distance, the old Wycliffe manor still stood, a dark, silent monument against the sky, its gates chained, its windows boarded, a monument to a dark history now sealed away forever. Croft was imprisoned in the capital, his centuries-long plot for revenge ending not in triumph, but in a cold stone cell. Alistair was alive. He walked hand in hand with Rose through the village, his step sure and steady. The recovery had been arduous, a long, slow battle to purge the poison from his body, but he was free. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, profound peace. He was thinner, perhaps, and his hair was now streaked with a silver that had not been there before, but he looked younger, lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his soul. The villagers greeted them as they passed, not with the bowed heads of deferential tenants, but with the warm smiles and friendly nods of neighbors. He was no longer just their duke, a remote figure of power and fear. He was Alistair, the man who had helped them rebuild a wall, the man they had saved. Rose, her hand resting on her visibly pregnant belly, glowed with a serene, quiet strength. She was the architect of this new world, the woman who had refused to be a victim and had become a savior instead. Alistair stopped and looked at her, at the fierce, defiant love in her eyes, at the gentle curve of her stomach that held their future, and he finally, truly understood. The Wycliffe curse was never about a fungus in the stones. Not really. That was just the mechanism. The true curse was the pride that made his ancestors hide from the world, the fear that made them value legacy over love, the isolation that made them prisoners in their own home. Rose had not just saved him from the poison, she had saved him from himself. He had thought he needed to send her away to protect her from his darkness, but her light was the only thing that could have ever led him out. He found the courage to love her not by banishing her, but by following her out of the shadows and into the Sunday. Their future would not be built on the crumbling, poisoned stones of the past, but on a new foundation of community, of courage, and of a love that had faced down death itself and had won.